My name is Elke Krasny and I'm based in Vienna, where I work as a professor for art and education at the Academy of Fine Arts. And apart from being an educator and a professor at an art academy, I also work as a curator, mostly on architecture and urbanism. I'm interested in doing research on feminist historiographies of curation. And I guess that feminism comes into this in two ways. On one hand, as a question of method or how we approach certain issues, but also I'm interested in investigating feminisms as an object of investigation, how feminisms change over time and how they are not static, and how there are so many different feminisms existing in parallel, after each other, next to each other, adjacent to each other, in conflict with each other, in dialogue with each other, in productive exchanges. To use a word or two words from my native language, which is German, I'm interested in this intersection between Sammlung, which means collection, and Versammlung, which means assembly. And one of them is deeply rooted, you could say, in things to do with museum practice and with also knowledge practices that collect. And assembly has a lot to do with an understanding of the political and of politics, and that they share the same root I find very interesting. And so that exhibitions can actually be political spaces in the way they navigate knowledge, I think makes them an interesting territory for feminist disruptions, feminist interventions, feminist transformations. As we all know, the word curating shares a Latin root with the word care, so curare actually means to care. And therefore it sits between productive and reproductive labor, to use this Marxist feminist language. So it's something that is on one hand emotional, intellectual, but it also deals with money, resources, spaces, budgets, and to do that in a feminist way, so that there is an understanding that the way in which spaces, institutions, budgets are shared and distributed more equally between all genders is something that I think feminist curators in and outside of the institution can fight for and can make part of their practice. So I'm speaking about the invisible labor in preparing things like conversations or preparing exhibitions, and that this is also part of a field of feminist intervention. And I guess what I also find interesting is that there are ways of curating that allow people to understand feminisms better. So what is the feminist exploration of what is called the gaze? What are ways of engaging with feminist practices that come into being from different parts of the world, and how can an exhibition be a space in which they meet and become this kind of political assembly, if you will. I just did an exhibition at the Architecture Center in Vienna together with my colleague, co-curator Angelika Fitz, who is also the director of the Architecture Center. It's called Critical Care, Architecture and Urbanism for a Broken Planet. And we look at feminist care ethics as they were developed by thinkers like Joan Tronto, but also many others, as a point of entry to understand how architecture and urbanism can actually be caring practices, as they take care of human bodies, non-human bodies, but also the environment and what we might call our planet. And even though we did not label this exhibition as a feminist project in the name of it, it was clearly a feminist project in the sense of what kind of practices are being shown. And I don't think that all feminist practices have to be practiced by female identified bodies. I think feminism is not necessarily women centric. Feminist insistence is something that we need at the moment. So insisting on having complex conversations, and maybe not only complex and conflictual conversations, but maybe most importantly, nuanced conversations in which many differences can be differentiated from each other, is part of my current feminist practice. I don't understand feminist architecture as a specific style, so I wouldn't say there is, or at least not the way I would theorize it. It's not about shapes that are round, to say something a little bit naive or silly sounding. But I would say it's the way architecture takes care of human bodies and tries to be mindful of the resources that are being used, working in ways in which those who then inhabit the spaces have a say as to what their spaces should look like. I think something I've been thinking about is that in architecture we speak about the brief as the description as to what is being needed, what an architect responds to in her or his work. The client's brief, or a government can give a brief. And I think it would be really interesting to say, okay, we are building a new government, but we want a feminist brief for it, and to actually understand what are the types of infrastructures that would need to be in there in order to make that a more feminist and more inclusive building. And these are things that I will want to work on more in the future.